Hi everyone, this is Tracy. I've done a comparison video of a number of quote yellow box unquote vintage and modern Rider Waite Smith decks that I've acquired. First of all, I would like to do a shout out here to Lisa at Mindful Tarot for sparking this obsession in me and providing me with about half of the research. I've put links to her videos in the description below. Some additional information was provided by Mary K. Greer in a post that she added at Aeclectic.net about the history of the printing of this deck. The main purpose of this video is to give you a look at several different vintage versions of the deck. The modern one you can get at retail now is pretty awful, but some of the vintage decks are much better looking, and they're not that hard to find. A new one will be cheaper, of course, but none of these decks cost me any more than $40. So I hope this video can help you narrow down your search if you're on the hunt for a vintage Rider Waite Smith deck. I've got 5 vintage decks to show you, as well as 3 that you can get new today. These are the boxes for the 5 vintage decks and the current deck. The one in the upper left is the University Press deck from, I think, the late 60s. It's the one with the pink back with the ankh on it. I'm going to call this one the University Press deck. To the right of that is a deck published by Samuel Weiser from the early 1970s. I'm going to call this one the Weiser deck. The far right on the top row is a U.S. Games version when they were located at 468 Park Avenue, which is where U.S. Games was until about 1980, according to the post by Mary K. Greer. And I'll call this one the 70s deck. The bottom left is a version where U.S. Games was at 38 East 32nd Street in New York, and according to Mary K. Greer, this is where U.S. Games was from about 1980 to about 1990. So I'll call this one the 80s deck. The middle bottom, they had moved to Stamford, Connecticut by the time that deck was made, and that was about 1990, so I'm going to call that one the 90s deck. And the bottom right is a deck that I bought new a couple of weeks ago. This I'm going to call the new deck. And you'll notice on the new deck there's a copyright after the word deck on the top. This is a cue that the deck isn't very old, because they haven't been doing that for very long from what I understand. This image shows the back of all of those boxes. This is the back of the University Press box. This is the back of the Weiser box, and you notice it was printed in Switzerland. This is the back for the 70s box, printed in Switzerland. The back for the 80s box, also printed in Switzerland, but also has the ISBN number on the back. And then the 90s box, we're still being printed in Switzerland at this point. This is the back of the new box. It is printed in Italy. And if you're looking for a vintage deck, get one that was printed in Switzerland. They're better, they're not as glossy, the colors are better, the cardstock is better. And from what I understand, production was moved to Italy in about 2004. Here are the bottoms of the boxes. I have removed the University Press deck from this image and from the next one. The box for that deck is pretty distinctive. You should be able to recognize it, plus the bottom of that box is gone on mine. And it looks like barcodes with ISBN numbers were added in the 90s. And here we have the tops of the boxes. The Weiser deck does say Samuel Weiser on the top. Here are the right sides of the boxes. The front face is left, and here we have the left side of the boxes. And you can notice that the new one has the U.S. Games Fool on it. And here we have the University Press, Weiser, and the 70s deck. None of these decks have a copyright in the lower right corner of each card. U.S. Games started adding the copyright about 1975. So I do now know that my 70s deck is a pre-1975 deck because of this. The colors on the University Press deck are bright, and the print quality is not very good. The Weiser and 70s decks are pretty similar. Here's a closer look at the University Press Fool card. And then we have the Weiser Fool card. And then we have the 70s deck Fool card. Here are the Hermit cards in the University Press, Weiser, and 70s decks. You can really see the color variations in the blue on this card. And here are the close-ups of the bottoms of all three of those decks. You can see the color variations pretty well. You can see how much better some of them are drawn, and you can see that there are no copyrights on any of these cards. Now, let me go off on a little tangent here about the University Press deck. It is absolutely awful. The cardstock is thin and horrible, and the colors and lines aren't good. And look at how badly this card was cut. My advice, my opinion, don't waste your money trying to get this deck. If anyone has this deck and has some missing cards, let me know. Put a comment down below. My deck is missing the Ten of Pentacles, so if you need a replacement card for a University Press deck, I will be glad to send you one of the cards out of my deck. And this is the last we will see of the University Press deck in this video. And here we are back at the Hermits again. This is one of my favorite cards. In all four of the vintage decks, and in chronological order, and in the new deck on the far right. Here we have the Hermit in the 80s deck. You can see the copyrights on the bottom right. And the 90s deck. And here we have the modern deck, or the new deck. Notice the text is different. And according to Mary Kay Greer's post, the text was changed from Pamela Coleman Smith's calligraphy and was replaced with the typeset that we see here in about 1995. Here are the death cards in the Wiser and the 70s deck. The death cards in the 80s and 90s deck. And here's the death card in the new deck. Let's have a look at the Five of Swords in all of these decks. There's a lot of color and detail in the Five of Swords cards. So here we have the Wiser Five of Swords. And next we have the 70s deck Five of Swords. Then this is the 80s deck Five of Swords. The 90s deck. And finally the new deck. Let's have a look at one more card. This is the Knight of Swords in all of those decks. He has also got a lot of detail and color. This would be the Wiser deck, the 70s deck, the 80s deck, the 90s deck, and the new deck. Here are the extra cards that should come with each deck. The Wiser deck and the 70s deck come only with blank cards. I'm not really sure about the 80s deck. I only got one extra card with that deck, but it really should have had two extra cards with that deck. The 90s deck comes with one blank card and one with popular decks and books. The new deck has a card with other decks listed on it and a card about Pixie. If you see someone on eBay selling a vintage deck that has the Pixie card and also has the web address on the back of the box, that deck isn't really a vintage deck. Now we can have a look at the little white books that came with each of the decks. The University Press deck and the Wiser deck came to me without a little white book, so I don't know what those look like. This is the little white book for the 70s deck. It's on a matte finish paper. Here's the inside page for the 70s little white book. It looks like this was the 8th printing of this little white book. This is the little white book for the 80s deck. It's printed on high gloss paper. And the inside page for the 80s deck, we're up to printing number 24. This is the little white book for the 90s deck. We're still on the glossy paper here. And the inside page for the 90s deck, it looks like we're up to printing number 33. Finally, here's the little white book for the new deck. We have the Empress on the front, and it's back to matte paper, and we're up to printing number 60. After shuffling and looking at the cards from all the decks, I picked the 80s deck as my favorite vintage deck to actually use for readings. I thought I would show that one deck next to a couple of other decks that you can buy new today. The deck in the middle is called the original Rider Waite Tarot deck. It has the rose and lily design on the back, and I actually got this copy from the Book Depository in the UK. It's a British version and it cost about $10. The one on the right is the Smith Waite Tarot Centennial Edition. And here's our friend the Hermit again. I picked this card because it clearly shows how differently these decks are colored. The original Rider Waite Tarot is loaded with sepia tones. Things that should be gray look brown to me. The Centennial deck is also much darker, but it's not as brown. Both the original Rider Waite Tarot and the Centennial deck have super thick cardstock that I find it really hard to shuffle. And of all these decks, my favorite is one that is probably produced sometime in the 80s. The cardstock is great. It's bendy enough without being too bendy. The finish on the cards is very matte. It's not glossy at all like the new version. And the colors are bright but not too obnoxious. The detail comes through as well. Thanks for watching and have a great day.